Hi, I'm Carrie.
And I'm Molly.
And you're listening to the Two Sisters on Adventures podcast. So as you'll remember, we're on the Loowit Trail, which is the trail that circumnavigates Mount St Helens. So we had decided that we were going to get up very early this morning and just hit the trail. Do we want to be on trail by 6? Because
I think so, because I set my alarm for 5 a.m.
Mm-hmm. And so I think it rained on us a little bit during the night, right? So it was windy, but nowhere near as bad as wind as we thought there was going to be, which I was glad about.
And I'd still say that the wind was pretty intense. Every once in a while you'd hear a gust moving down the mountain, but then by the time it reached our camp, which we were once again we had bushes on all around us, so we just pitched our tent inside of a little thicket of bushes. And so you could hear the wind start to move down the mountainside, like what we heard when we were on the Timberline Trail, but it never really even hit our tent too much, which Carrie had done some research actually about that, or actually you learned about it in your mountaineering book, right?
I learned that apparently there's just this phenomena that happens right after sunset where wind, just because of, I don't know if it's the temperature drop or what, wind typically will just rush down the mountain on steeper or more exposed mountainsides. And so you'll get those really intense winds 1 to 2 hours after the sun sets, and then usually it kind of wanes away. And I was like, that's actually helpful to understand, because it was when we pitched our tents on Mount Hood in that windy area, it wasn't windy at all. Yeah. So we had no clue kind of that all of a sudden these huge winds were going to just bust it down the mountainside and hit our tent. But it's nice to kind of keep in mind now that knowledge of it may not be windy and there may not be a forecast for high winds, but a lot of the time, after sunset, there are certain areas where it is just going to be more likely to be windy. So yes, they're definitely, I guess I just thought it was going to be catastrophically windy, and it wasn't that way. So to me, I was there's barely any wind at all, but I definitely could hear it. And like I said, it rained a little bit, and then it felt pretty humid, honestly, even in our tent. Before we got in our tent, it was already getting humid. That whole scenario where it's oh man, did I leave my backpack just sitting open? Because if I did, probably the stuff inside of it is going to be kind of wet. So when Molly's alarm went off around 5, we were okay, we have to hit it. This is a huge day where, we're going to have weight on our backs, and the trail is long and complex. So we have to get after it. But I opened up our tent, and it wasn't quite light out, it was starting to get a little bit light, but I could just see we were inside of a cloud. And
Return of the cloud. Yay.
I know. Hey, is it possible that that clouds sit on the mountainside?
I think it might actually be the case, Carrie.
Yeah, so sometimes they just sit on the mountainside. Anyway, so I opened it, I looked outside, I was look, we are literally inside of a cloud. It had been drizzling, I feel kind of directly prior to that. So we kind of just looked at each other and were we hadn't slept the best that night. I think I'd just kind of been up tossing and turning. And so we said, okay, I guess that we'll just kind of leave it alone, give ourselves another half hour, 45 minutes of rest, and then we'll get up and see how it looks after that. And how it looked after that was the cloud was lifting, but not completely gone. So and by lifting, we mean instead of maybe 20 feet of visibility, we had 40 feet of visibility. Yeah. Although, remember that moment when we were outside getting our stuff together and you're oh my goodness, the sky is blue. And there was that hole where we could see blue sky. So we were maybe it's going away. So we did finally get up, and this was the morning that we decided to try something new. Instead of our oatmeal and coffee that we make over the jet boil, that's kind of our tried and true, we had something that they call rec packs. So it's this company, and they make nutritionally complete meals. It's about 700 calories per meal, but they also have electrolytes. They have, it has a good mix of carbs and fats and all that kind of stuff. And the company had sent it to us to ask us if we would try it out and see if we liked it. And this seemed like such a perfect opportunity. Remember, we're trying to travel a little bit lighter, a little bit faster. We were we can mix these up and drink them as we walk. And on the package, it says if it's cold enough outside, it lasts for 4 days after you mix it up. So we knew that we had at least a period of several hours where we could drink them before they might get weird. So Molly started kind of packing up our tent, and I was in charge of making the rec packs. And the other thing that we brought, because we weren't bringing coffee this time, We brought these things called packaroons. It's by Heather's Choice. And they are basically like these little coconut cookies that are also for this specific type. There's other kinds that don't have caffeine in them, but these ones were like infused with espresso. So when I was at the store, I was like, I know I need a little bit of caffeine to get through my day. Like I would never want to set up my body for a really long, intense day on trail and be like, and today's the day you're quitting caffeine. So we tried the packaroons and it was so good. Like I don't know. It was like a macaroon and a coconutty and espresso-y. And so that was just like kind of a little mood booster because
Carrie said that the person who, I think the guy working at the checkout at REI said they were really tasty. So I had a pretty good expectation before I tried it. And it was very good. It met or exceeded my expectations as far as just like flavor and texture. So the packaroon was awesome. And I think that was like 160 calories. And it was fairly small in size. And then I was a little bit nervous to try the rec pack because I knew that just calorically it was perfect for what we were trying to do. And the fact that we could, drink some down as our, like, in quotations, breakfast, and then have it also to like just drink as a snack would be awesome as well. And like thinking about typically how we make our oatmeals, I think our oatmeal is like 300 calories or so per person to start off the day. So this is over twice of what we would have for our typical breakfast. And it's like, I'm not the type of person that would have like a protein shake as a meal replacement. I've tried that before and I feel like my stomach just feels weird. Like I need like some type of a solid food to feel like I've had a meal, and that's just who I am as a person. So I was a little bit worried that like, oh gosh, here we go. We're committing to this. And it was awesome that when I drank it, it was like the consistency was good. It wasn't something that you'd feel like it was like weirdly gaggy, like in the morning, or if you were just like not feeling hungry. And then the way it sat in my stomach was how a normal meal would. I would say that there wasn't really any adverse effect. If anything, it was really easy to eat. And then even when Carrie and I were walking, there's something about like if you're gonna have a bar, like if I'm going downhill, I can eat a bar while I'm moving, but usually going uphill, it's hard to chew and like eat something that's a little bit drier, especially while you're like basically putting effort into something. So that was really nice to just be able to like have a couple slurps and be like, wow, I probably drank like 100 calories right now. So I was really impressed with it in the end for our breakfast.
Yeah, I was as well. And so we got to Windy Pass fairly quickly, unfortunately.
But not as quick as I wanted to. It was kind of ridiculous because Windy Pass was maybe 1.5 miles from where we camped. And I was hoping, to make like, once again, too ambitious, but like I was like, okay, if we could get 3 miles an hour for at least a few hours, then we can kind of set us up for success when we end up like meeting some obstacles. And I swear we'd been walking for like an hour by the time we got to Windy Pass, and I was just like, why are we not going faster?
And I think it was especially disappointing too, just because of the fact that there was not really, like, if there was any uphill, it was so minimal I don't even remember it or think I noticed it. And so I think that was the other thing that made it feel kind of disappointing. But it was funny because, again, this is a trail where you have to constantly pay attention. You can't be a daydreamer. And I feel like we were paying attention, but you cross this little creek, which is not always there to my understanding, but currently flowing very well as of like June 22nd. And we cross that little creek bed. And then like as you come out, there's really no cairns and there's like 5 different discernible footpaths. So we kind of started up towards Windy Pass. And this was something where it really helped me to have read trail reviews before, because as we started up towards what we thought was Windy Pass, we found ourselves kind of walking up this snowfield. And I thought to myself, this is really odd because and
it was like pretty steep. Like it was like, okay, we're going up a steep snowfield.
Yeah. And I thought to myself, okay, this is kind of weird because in the book that we were talking about, Trekking Washington, the author had said, go up, and he was going counterclockwise as well in his book. So it should apply for us. He had said something about ascend the gentle switchbacks up Windy Pass. And I thought, okay, this is pretty weird that there's no switchbacks and it doesn't look like there's any coming up, which again, there's a huge cloud. So it's not like we could see the end of the snowfield to know like, oh, you go up it and then you get to some switchbacks. And then I started thinking to myself, well, I've read the trail reviews recently and they all said there's no snow on Windy Pass. It's all melted out, blah, blah, blah. And I thought, I don't think this is quite right. So I said, hey, Molly, like, let's take a second, reassess what's going on, because I read two things, gentle switchbacks and no snow. And here we are ascending a steep-ish snow slope. And then we kind of started looking around, and Molly was like, oh yeah, well, the reason that neither of those things are true for right here is because I can see up on the like kind of sheer wall next to us, there's a trail higher above us. So that was kind of like a little bit ironic and funny, and also not funny, obviously, because you're trying to make good time. And so we actually were able to scramble up to where the trail was, so we didn't have to actually go back down and then regain the elevation. But it is kind of tricky to scramble up something like that just because it's all moving rocks and you're not even on a footpath that's been kind of tamped down. So we scrambled up there, reminded ourselves every second, every time, you have to be paying attention and not only looking at where you're going or the footsteps that you saw, but paying attention, because I feel like there were some footsteps there, probably by other people who'd been a little bit messed up. You can't only pay attention to that. You also have to, as much as you can, take in the bigger picture. So probably not a good option to go there if it was too dark or hard to see.
Also, a slightly humorous reminder of, when you're like looking at footprints in the sand and you're like, oh, I think the trail must go here because I'm seeing these footprints. It reminds me of when we did our Copper Ridge Loop trail and we were like walking along trying to like connect two parts of the trail where there was a washout. And I was like, oh, I think we're like doing fine because here's footprints. And then had a realization that I think I was actually just looking at my own footprints from earlier. So there's only so much you can trust as far as footprints that you see. So be aware of your surroundings. And we definitely found the correct portion of the trail and like continued on from there safely. So we ascended Windy.
I will say it was slightly ironic because we looked at our GPS to verify we were on trail and it had us like directly next to the trail. So we were like, oh, GPS isn't always right. Yeah. But in that case, we weren't right.
Yeah. And so we continued to ascend Windy Pass, and it really is a pretty short ascent. We headed up, and once again, it's that more gravelly, kind of sandy texture. And then all of a sudden, we were at the pass. There's like a post there, and it shows that we're entering the blast zone. And I think in the book in Trekking Washington, it talks about some pretty sweeping views. And for us, we had like at least the clouds were like somewhat lifting where the mountain was socked in, but like you could tell that the sun was like trying to fight its way through a little. But we definitely didn't have too broad of views, but I could see how that would be a very scenic area. And I think sometimes people actually camp on Windy Pass. Is that right?
Yeah, you can camp like before the post. I mean, I think that it is a question mark as to if I'd want to camp there versus slightly below it, just because I can see it's named Windy Pass because it can get super windy there. But also, if you wanted to camp there, as long as you're not camping in the blast zone, you're fine. So it's kind of cool then because it's like a switch kind of flips in your mind where you're like, now we're entering the blast zone. And one thing about Mount St Helens that you may or may not know is most volcanoes, when they erupt, they go up in the air, right? Like straight up. They blow their top is kind of what you say. But Mount St. Helens was a really unique and unexpected eruption because it had what they call a lateral blast. So it actually exploded out the side of the mountain versus going straight up in the air. And so when it had that lateral blast, right, it sent all of this like crumbling rock and like lava and all that kind of stuff just straight out and down, and it got rid of that entire side of the mountain. So it was kind of cool to me because where we were about to walk was basically land that had not existed 45 years ago because, right, we're 44 years after the blast. And so it kind of like really goes into your mind, like, I'm no longer on a part of Mount St. Helens that, I mean, all of the geography of everything changed, but that would be where it's changed the most.
We started to descend Windy Pass to enter the blast zone. And definitely it took a little bit of time and care with our footing as we descended, just because everything was like a little bit wet from the rain that had occurred the night before. And it's just a narrow kind of steeper section. So it takes a little bit of attention, but we made our way down Windy Pass and actually into kind of that actual true blast zone region. And so the first thing we encountered when we got down there was just like a little mini, not really I don't know, just kind of an area where maybe there was a lava flow or water flow at one point. You kind of walk into a sandy section of what would seem like a riverbank, but there's no river there, and then climb back out. And then almost immediately after that, we started to encounter a little bit more vegetation. So on the east side, on the Plains of Abraham, I believe they called it a pumice plain. And so there was, during the eruption, lava flowed over on that side and buried, a lot of the terrain that was there before, and caused us this plain of pumice. And in the front of Mount St. Helens on the north side where the blast occurred, I think something similar happened there. But at this area, there's actually either some mosses, grasses, or then as we continued walking, lupin and other wildflowers that were really thriving there. And we got there right at the beginning of the bloom. But I'm sure that kind of middle of July, that whole area will just be absolutely lit up with the colors of flowers.
And the thing that was so cool about this area was the clouds started lifting even more. So even though we weren't getting a view of Mount St. Helens specifically, which is always funny because you're right on it, so it seems like you should have a great view of it, we were getting really decent views of Spirit Lake, which would be the place where all of those trees float that were completely just they went in there during the mudslide or the blast, and so they're all stripped of all their there's no sticks on them, but there's this mass of logs that float around the lake, kind of based on the wind direction. So we could see Spirit Lake, which is just a cool thing to see. We could see the Mount Margaret backcountry, which is it's so rugged and unique looking and beautiful. And we could see all of this terrain. The only thing we couldn't see was the mountain, which of course you want to see into the crater because that's half of the draw of going to the north side. But luckily we have seen into the crater before from some other areas. So as we walked along, this area I would say was definitely a lot more simple. There was less thinking involved. The trail was a little bit more well-defined. The footing was a little bit more stable. We weren't exactly going along any massive cliffs, so it was kind of pretty low consequence if you tripped and fell. Uh-huh. So it felt like you didn't have to focus as much, and it was just really cool to be in that little area of history, really.
And pretty worthwhile to be paying attention to your surroundings at this time, because I think we saw 3 separate herds of mountain goats, and they all wanted, they were all higher up on the slope. So it was interesting because the cloud level, the herds of goats that we saw were kind of right underneath the clouds, and because of there was all this just greenness, and then the clouds and the goats, and then some waterfalls popping into view, it very much felt like the terrain of somewhere like Iceland, which makes sense, right, being a very volcanic place, as we're on a volcano that erupted 44 years ago.
And the fun thing about the goats too is some of the goats had little babies. And I feel like we've seen quite a few mountain goats and mountain goat babies in our life, which is very awesome. But these were the tiniest little mountain goat babies we've ever seen, because I think typically mountain goats seems to have their babies in June. Mm-hmm. So these babies were probably only a couple weeks old. Mm-hmm. So they were little teeny tiny babies on the mountainside, and that was really fun to see. After this, you kind of are fortunate to cross some decent, areas of water. We didn't even really need to grab any water because we grabbed plenty that morning and it hadn't been too hot, so we weren't drinking a ton. But as you continue on, you kind of end up in this wide sandy expanse where, again, you have to pay a lot of attention to where the trail goes, because it gets kind of to be an area where it feels like there's just a lot of footsteps and it's not necessarily super clear. And as we were kind of heading across this area, we saw another guy coming towards us. He was hiking the trail clockwise, so the opposite direction of us. And he did kind of stop to chat with us and let us know there'd be a little river crossing up ahead. He said he'd had to scout up and down the whole river until he found a rock that he was able to just rock hop on. And so he kind of gave us that information. And of course, I really appreciated him doing that. And I thought that was very valuable. But as always, you have to take someone's personal experience and kind of file it away. And also know that when you get there, you'll have to make your own decision. So when we finally reached the little creek / river, immediately I didn't feel too intimidated by it. It probably would be intimidating for some people, but I think we've crossed enough creeks and glacial streams in our life that it looked pretty classic. It didn't seem to be running too crazy fast or too crazy hard. And rather than scouting up and down the river to find the single rock hop he'd done, which he said was kind of a big jump, and that's not usually my vibe, We saw basically right where we stood, the stream was super braided out. So we saw like a series of several rock crossings. And Molly went ahead and led the way on those. They were for the most part pretty simple. I mean, we were there at about 9:30 in the morning. So, it certainly could get more complex as the day goes on. But it was nice because like approaching the riverside, it wasn't like those weird, steep, crumbly riverbank. So it was kind of like you already were at the same elevation as the bank. So it was not complicated to get down to. And I did get my shoe wet because on like the last little rock hop that we had to do, I overshot it with my powerful jumping legs. And so my foot did skitter off the rock and go in the water. But again, it was not at all. I mean, we were in a spot where it was totally fine and totally safe for us. So after we crossed the river, I feel like we really enjoyed some awesome views right there. There was this waterfall that we were so fortunate to be able to see because the fog was like right above it, but where you could see that, I mean, it was just like the end of rock and then this, I don't know, maybe a couple 100-foot drop. I can't guesstimate height from far away, as you've probably figured out. But it was this very tall waterfall with a dramatic drop. And there was another one that we could see that had, it was dropping onto a rock and splitting out into all these different streams. And it was just so cool. And again, felt like you were in Iceland, but with like no other people there. It was very quiet out that day, like especially in the morning and in the blast zone because nobody can camp there anyway. Either there were some people behind us who hadn't really started their day yet, or there were people who were coming from the Toutle River, which is 10 miles across. So you weren't going to see a ton of people at that time.
So we'd been making our way through the blast zone for a while and we hadn't even encountered any goalies. So of course we were due for a couple goalies. So we came to a series of, I think it was about 3 goalies in a row. And probably the first one that we crossed, once again going counterclockwise, was probably the most challenging. And the real thing that made it challenging wasn't necessarily how far, like how deep it was, but there was just a section on the way out where there was really very minimal discernible footpath. Like I think it's just that the rocks, the gravel is like so shifty that you can't create any type of a path in it because it just keeps eroding away. So there was probably like 4 or 5 steps we had to take where it was just like, well, hopefully where I'm putting my foot holds and it's okay. And then it like, I feel like affected me a little bit where then I was like, anytime we started to approach a goalie, I was like, oh no, what's it going to be? And it's funny because every time we approached one, I thought it was going to be like this horrible, scary task. And it seemed like it was really not too bad. And a fair number of them, as we continued to go westward, there started to be more vegetation. So that was really nice because it seemed like the vegetation was holding things together. But basically we're walking through all these little meadows of wildflowers. The sun was coming out a little bit stronger, so we were actually getting more and more views to the north. We could see the Johnson Ridge Observatory, and it was just like, once again, just a very pleasant day for walking. And even though we couldn't see Mount St. Helens because it was still covered by a cloud, it was really nice to have just good temperatures for walking. And I could think about how if it was like 75 or 80 degrees, it'd probably feel pretty brutal out there because it's all very exposed.
And I will say that one thing about that goalie that felt so frustrating is when you're ascending on essentially pumice, the thing that is really hard is like, if it was rocky, you could probably, reach out and grab onto a rock above you. But it was like you didn't even want to touch the larger rocks above you because the chances were high that they were not connected to anything and that if you touched them, then they could just roll down onto you. So it definitely was one of those things where you had to be so careful of your footing. And I will say, I felt like going counterclockwise, we had better footing for all but maybe one descent into the goalies. Other than that, it felt like whenever we were ascending, the ascent for us was on the scarier terrain to me. And I think that probably if you went clockwise, you'd think we had it worse. So I don't know that I would use that as a reason to go counterclockwise versus clockwise, but I was appreciative of that fact.
And after we made it through like our second goalie for the day, we were just walking and I was like, my goodness, my like toes are so sore. Like they were feeling like I was going to get like a blister or something. And I was really confused because we'd only been walking for maybe 5 miles that day. And we've done a couple longer days, and we've been really consistent with our hiking this season. So I feel like our bodies are like phasing in and getting trained in. It's not like it was this big jump. And I was like, why are my feet feeling so sore? And I told Carrie, and she was like, well, do you want to like, take off your like socks and address it? And I was just like, I don't know. It feels a little different than like a blister would. It just feels like really tender. So I'll walk a little bit longer and see how it goes. And then Carrie kind of had a realization actually.
Yeah. So kind of earlier that day, I had become really frustrated because I have never had an issue with heel blisters. Like for all the hikes we've done, maybe at most I would occasionally get like a tiny hot spot, never a blister. But as I was walking that morning, I was like, I am getting a blister or something on my heel. It's just rubbing so bad. I don't understand it. I've worn these shoes for like probably at least 100 miles by now. They should be very well broken in. And I kind of went to take my shoe off. And when I pulled down my sock, I flipped out like 50 tiny little pieces of pumice. And I realized I was basically exfoliating my heel every step I took. And so when Molly was like, I just feel like I have so many hot spots in my foot, like I'm just feeling frustrated, I was like, maybe you should pull your socks off and see if you like wipe off your foot and bang out your socks if it fixes it. And I think you did that, and it did, right?
Yeah. And I think it was just, we were walking on very sandy terrain. It was kind of like similar to if you're walking on the beach actually. And so inevitably, I think especially when we went down into that steeper gully, I was getting like more of the sand in my shoes just because of how I had to position my feet. And so, yeah, it's interesting. Like this trail, if you have gaiters that are comfortable to wear over your shoes, that might be a nice solution to kind of avoid getting a lot of the sandy rocks in your shoes, or just like potentially, depending on how you're feeling after you get out of some of the gullies, just stopping to dump out your shoes might be valid as well. But yeah, that was something that was just interesting and I wasn't quite expecting. And so we got to about 8 miles in for the day, which I'd been doing the mental math. I figured I'd go on the side of like, the worst it could be distance wise, which was about 25 miles. And that ended up to be almost what we did. So, I can't help myself when we were like 4 miles in, I'm like, okay, I guess that's only 21 more miles to go. And so at this point we were 8 miles in. And so now we're only, 17 miles to go, but we're under 20. So that's good. And Carrie suggested that maybe we should take a sitting rest break because we've been walking for like 3 hours at this point.
Yeah. And I typically don't deal with like very many issues in my calves with cramping, but I hadn't had a morning electrolyte that day just because I think for some reason every year we think like, oh, we don't need to bring so much food. This is ridiculous. And then every year we really solidify that the amount of food we bring for a reason because it makes our bodies feel good consistently. So hopefully we've already found that discovery for this year.
I know we called it our shakeout backpacking trip. And because basically we need to remind ourselves, no, you need to bring more food.
Yeah. So we were about 8.5 miles in and I was feeling a little demoralized from the first gully. And I had gone and looked at my map because I thought I just need to know if there was like 20 gullies between us and the Toutle River. And luckily you can kind of tell how the topographic lines like line up. I could tell that there was only 2 to 3 more gullies. 3 more, I believed. And like, luckily we'd just gone through 2 of them, like boom, boom, very easy. They had a great footpath, but this was going to be before the next giant gully that I could see. And I kind of thought, I don't want to be trying to go up navigate some really complex terrain that could be very steep and at the same time have like some sort of a major calf cramp. So I was kind of like, I think we need to sit down, have a little electrolyte. I didn't want to stop either because it's like you just want to go, get it all done, be quick. But I think that one thing we've also learned is sometimes you have to pace yourself. You have to take your breaks. You have to eat your calories. And so we sat down and we had a little break, put on some sunscreen and had some electrolytes, which by the way, the watermelon Gator Light is like the best tasting electrolyte we've ever had. This is the first year that we're trying that. And it's like sour, but in a good way. I say everyone should try it. Anyway.
And I think on a longer backpacking trip, I'd still probably go with like the smaller size electrolyte, like a Propel. But because the Gator Light, the container is just bigger. So maybe we'd put in the powder in like a separate bag, but it tastes so good. So that was like a very much like a delight to have.
It was a real mood booster. And then it was like, okay, we got back up. I felt like, okay, I could go again.
And while we were sitting to rest, we were scoping out this gully because we were basically resting like along the edge of it. And it looked so deep, and the sides were like incredibly steep. And I was like visually scanning the opposite side to see where we might have to climb out. And I saw this like very thin like trail, but it like looked like it wasn't even a trail. Like Carrie and I had just come out of the gully where we had, you know, a section of like 15 or 20 feet where the footing was like really weird. And this looked like it was a section that was maybe like 60 feet long where the footing was weird and it was steep and a big drop. And I was just like, oh my gosh, like how are we even going to do this?
I know. And I was also kind of just like a little frustrated because I wanted to be feeling better and charging. But, you know, we both kind of were approaching it feeling a little apprehensive. And all of a sudden, do you remember the downhill that was through that crazy vegetation? That was as we descended into this gully. So all of a sudden, you kind of take this sharp left turn and you're in this literal tunnel of vegetation. You're in a tunnel of vegetation. You can hold on to absolutely everything. And even though the footpath is crazy narrow, if you step off, you could probably basically walk on the weird, crazy tree. Con, you're in a tunnel of vegetation and you're kind of like almost crawling along. But I was like, we kept being like, we will take this. We will take this. And it was interesting to see the transition from blast zone, like full on dead when Mount St. Helens erupted, to like suddenly a little bit more life is left. Like you could see some of the spots where it was cool because you could see the direction that the mountain exploded, right? So you would see these trees and all of the down trees are facing the exact same direction, basically looking like they were blasted into the ground. And then you'd look somewhere else and you could see that the way that the blast had erupted out of the mountain had been at a different angle because all of a sudden all the trees are laying in the same direction and blasted kind of into the ground. So that was cool.
And it's interesting too, because in like if you're up at like Coldwater Peak or on the Johnston Ridge, you'll find just the stumps of the trees, but no trees to be found. And then in this section, there were some they call like the toothpick like stumps, but then there's also trees like laying on the ground, but they're all like half buried, which is just interesting. And so as we got closer to the gully, we saw these trail runners on the other side, and they were actually going through this thicket. And so we realized that the area that we thought we were going to have to travel that was like really sketchy, steep gravel was not even a trail at all. Either it was like the path that maybe rockfall had created, or maybe a goat or something had made it like kind of a footpath through there. But we actually were going to get to ascend through some brush. And then as we entered the gully, it was like there was actual soil and grass holding the sides together. And it was nothing, like it wasn't even challenging. It was just fine. And so we were very happy. And we were trying to think of names for this gully. We were like, we're going to call it Hallelujah Gully because it was so much, like it was just so wonderful. Or one of Carrie's like friends had recommended at one point the Oh Be Joyful Loop in Colorado. And we were like, we're going to call this Oh Be Joyful Gully because it's just the most amazing gully that is not complicated at all. And we felt very safe and comfortable. So it's always fun when you think something's going to be way tougher and then you get surprised by how it's actually just fine. And that happened to us. And that was really, really a mood booster.
Thank you so much for listening to another episode of the
Two Sisters on Adventures podcast.
If you tune in next week, you might even get to hear when we finish the trail. But you also can see pictures and videos from this day on Facebook or Instagram at Two Sisters on Adventures. Thanks so much for listening, guys. Bye.